Record. Hello, welcome, beautiful humans, on a Friday evening to University of the Underground. This is our super special Moon Arkestra Whistleblowing Residency, and we are joined by the amazing Sahar Ahmed today, an old friend, a comrade, all of the things. I am Dr. Aditi Jagannathan, and I am programming this whistleblowing residency. I am many different things: a dreamer, a thinker, a listener, a friend to Sahar amongst many people. And yeah, it's an honor and such a joy to have you here, Sahar. We met at SOAS when we were doing our masters. God, how long ago was that? 7 years ago now, which is absolutely wild. And I remember very specifically meeting you like on the first or second day and just thinking, wow, who is this person? And we'd always go to the pub in Islington for like little rums and things and like trying to put the world to rights. And unbeknownst to me at the time, like you're an advocate, right? Like you were an advocate in Pakistan, and you are here in many ways as well. You have grappled with the difficulties of institutions, the racism, the gender-based violence, right, which is endemic in many different types of institutions. And I'm sure you can talk to that directly or allude to it later on. But when I think about whistleblowing, Sahar, like you truly do epitomize like the multi-dimensional spectrum of what it is to be a whistleblower. In like every kind of relationship that you interface with, you carry that truth speaking, right? And you can't stand lies. On any level. And so like that spirit of truth is your compass, and I'm so happy to have you here today, and I can't wait for all of these incredible thinkers who share space with us to witness your beauty and your intellectual rigor and just your amazing, humorous, beautiful self. So thank you. Welcome, Sahar Ahmed. Mwah.
Thank you, Aditi, and thank you so much, everyone, for having me. That was way too kind and way too generous, and I could say all the same things back about Aditi, to be honest, and even more. Um, but it is a friendship and a camaraderie and a relationship that is built on many years now of learning and being inquisitive and sharing that knowledge through the years with each other as well, both intellectual knowledge, personal knowledge gained about our souls, how to share those souls with other people, with each other. It's been a journey of knowing and understanding and learning. So I couldn't ask for a better person to ask me to speak to all of you about anything. And I'm so, if the sun is distracting with my face, please let me know. I can like pull a blind down. But I'm a bit blinded, but it's fine. So thank you so much, Aditi. It's lovely to speak to all of you. I just want to Aditi told a little bit about me, but I just want to tell you a little bit about myself as well before I continue, before I start rather, so that you have a bit of context as to who I am and what exactly my situationship is in life and where I'm coming from, and how that sort of frames the conversation I want to have with all of you, right? So, like Aditi said, I'm from Pakistan, grew up, born there, lived there my almost entire life till adulthood. Like I didn't move away from Pakistan till I was about 22, I think. So, definitely all my formative years were spent there. And I'm a lawyer by training, and by past profession. I was a barrister. I worked in Pakistan and in England for a long time. And the reason why that's important is because now I'm in Ireland. So I have lived in both the seat of colonialism and also into very different spaces that have been colonized and have a very interesting, very divergent yet very similar history as well. And yet places that, despite having such a similar experience and such a similar history, are not seen as the same, right? One is very overtly, very obviously a white country, and one is not. And how the white colonized see the white colonized peoples, how they see themselves versus the non-white colonized people, right? Like the similarities and the differences. And so I've occupied this strange, completely by chance, like there was no point, there was no, I mean, when Aditi and I met, there was absolutely no inkling, even remote like possibility of me ending up in Ireland. And then, you know, fast forward a few years and I'm in Ireland. And so it's an interesting and strange way that like the universe has worked into bringing me here, and to sort of culminating all my experiences and life happenings, as they were. I can't even call them all experiences, because I feel like they sometimes it just sort of happen to you and you don't necessarily experience them, right? So that have led me here. So I decided to leave the bar because I was working on a lot of stuff that wasn't feeding my soul, as is the want with capitalism, which forces you to do things you don't necessarily want to do. And I decided to study a bit more because I was working in human rights in Pakistan for a while, and I decided that, well, I need more grounding and I need more understanding of that. So I decided to do a PhD, and that's what brought me to Ireland. So for the last 6 years now, nearly 6 years, I have been studying religion and the law, and I've been studying the way religion works within and without the law, and how the two intersect, where they diverge, do they diverge at all, and the different relationships that the two have with each other and with the rest of society and all of us inhabiting these weird planes, where both law and religion also dominate sort of culture in a way, whether we want them to or not. So I've been sort of studying that and looking into it. And why I've been doing so is very framed by my personal life story, I suppose. I am a Muslim, but in Pakistan, I am a minority, a religious minority. So in Pakistan, I come from a denomination of Muslims who are not considered Muslims in Pakistan. So I am, Ramadan Mubarak to you as well. I am an Ahmadi Muslim, and the Ahmadis in Pakistan are constitutionally declared non-Muslims. So it's an interesting place to occupy in terms of identity, because the Ahmadis have for the longest time claimed Muslimhood, have claimed to be Muslim, and yet the law has worked against them by declaring them to be non-Muslims. And that has meant, and obviously has meant, like a trickle-down effect into all facets of identity, right? That affects citizenship, that affects, you know, voting rights. It affects, you know, what kind of benefits you can access from the state. It benefits so many, it affects so many different things in life, right? And especially in places that are so heavily charged and so heavily influenced by religion, where religion sort of like dominates the vernacular so much. So you know, growing up as an Ahmadi Muslim in Pakistan, I grew up with this dual identity of wanting to occupy my Muslimness as a political act, and yet growing up, and you know, being taught to grow up as devout, but then growing up, you know, and trying to learn religion for myself, seeing where I sit within this relationship with religion, and you know, choosing to cherry picking parts of it that I like and parts that I don't like and don't want. And but it was interesting. It was an interesting and weird place to be, where you know, I wanted to shout from the rooftops that I'm Muslim, but because I wasn't allowed to do so where I'm from, at home, right? And so that sort of led me to this inquiry that I took with my PhD, to sort of look into but that's weird, like religion is supposed to be this very personal thing. Where does the law come in from? Where does the state come in from? Why does the state come in? It sounds quite simplistic, but like, surely there has to be some reasoning behind this, what's going on, basically, simply put. And that led me to this inquiry that I started taking. And, personal growth led me to see how, surprise, surprise, colonialism is very linked to everything and anything that we study in this world, that we try to understand in this world, particularly if we're Black or brown bodies, particularly if we're gender minorities, right? Particularly if we occupy different marginalized identities and they intersect on top of that, right? So it was an interesting inquiry to start taking, which led me just to start thinking about how, if we're looking into religion, we're looking into the law, must we look at them together? Must we look at them intrinsically intertwined, right? Can we really know what religion, and we'll get into it in a second as to what religion might mean, but just from popular media, just the word religion, whatever it means to us, whatever we think it means to us, does religion and what we think it is, does it have to be understood through the lens of law? And if it doesn't, then why are we doing it? Why are we understanding it from the lens of law? And what's wrong with that? What's going on? You'll hear me say what's going on quite a few times, because I feel like that sort of undergirds my entire way of life, which is every few minutes just to be like, well, what's going on? And so you'll hear me say that quite often. But if sort of to bring it back a little bit to what Aditi was talking about, like, you're all doing this whistleblowing residency, and I was fascinated by the idea of whistleblowing as truth seeking and unveiling. I loved that, right? Because and as a decolonial, and then as a result as a decolonial praxis, because an inquiry into what's going on is essentially that. It's an essentially looking into trying to seek out the truth, trying to unveil through the and can I say it even though it's recorded, like the absolute fuckery of of colonialism and how it's sort of shrouded, right? Like the truth and like placed a veil really in front of our eyes as to what we think we know, and us doubting it, right? So I absolutely love that, because that's the entire point of my entire inquiry into looking into law and religion, right? So something that I have discovered in my through my studies and through my advocacy is that, and this will not be of surprise to most of you, for those of us who, again, like live different marginalized identities and realities, that different international systems that we live within, right? Whether it is capitalism, whether it is democracy, all these multiple different systems that we inhabit and we live within are predicated on neocolonial and Western ideas, right? And the law, and in particularly the kind of law that I am interested in, the kind of law that sort of affects all of us, as opposed to just, national identities, but international human rights law, right? When we hear the term human rights talked about quite a bit in the media. We hear it talked about in the media. We hear it talked about in positives and negatives. We hear of people's rights being taken away. We hear of people fighting for their rights. So at this point in time, when if we haven't really studied the concept of rights, it's a catch-all phrase really that can mean anything and everything at this point. But the system within which that phrase comes from, the international human rights legal system, wherein we say, an X population's rights are being infringed or violated, that system inherently is predicated on a neocolonial Western idea as well. And that neocolonial Western idea, that of being rights, couched in concepts of saving the global South, right? If for those of us who are living in the Western Hemisphere, I'm not sure if all of us are, but if most of us are living in the Western part of the world, which doesn't mean anything because geography is, is also made up. But if we're living in predominantly white institutionalized countries, then we've heard endlessly of the history of, the world wars, and we've heard of where, we've heard of the UN. We hear these terms quite often, and that is essentially where the concept of rights, and Aditi will know this even better than I do, but that's essentially where the concept of rights has essentially come from. And whether we wanted it to be or not, whether we think we are parts of the cogs in the machine or not, it does come from concepts of saving the global south. Religion within that same is the same, right? Religion within that system is the same. It's no different than anything else within that system. And so the right to freedom of religion, because that's essentially where my interest came from, right? My own personal experiences informing that, is heavily influenced by overtly Christian, specifically liberal Protestant ideas of what religion is. So automatically someone who is me, who started off by saying, I want to proclaim that I'm Muslim, very Muslim loud from the rooftops, is immediately at a disadvantage at the very start of this conversation even. We see this in the courtroom as well. We see it in every courtroom. We see this in jurisprudence coming out from Europe. We see this in jurisprudence coming out from the US, from Canada, from Australia, from everywhere really. We see that if we keep using me as the face of all of this, let's say, Muslim women and their right to wear hijabs, niqabs, veils in publics, they're the ones that predominate the conversations when it comes to religion and the law and public spaces at the moment. They're what seems to be, they are who seem to be in the headlines all the time. They're who seem to be talked about the most as well. Another identity that is no longer talked about too much, and there's a lot of different political factors for this, but Sikh men were initially also subsumed in this vitriol that Muslim women were facing as well, right? Overtly different, overtly identifiable, overtly other, right? And overtly other very much so, not just because of race, but very much so because of a religious identity that is obvious. So Sikh men wearing turbans as well. But if we take this even one step further, this actually extends to many more different identities as well. Orthodox Christian denominations who want to hold public ceremonies, right? We don't see that very often in the streets of London, or in the streets of Dublin, for example, or in Paris. Jehovah's Witnesses, right? And their various abstentions, and how the law around the world deals with those abstentions. Are they seen as being valid? The fact that we have external bodies and external to the Jehovah's Witnesses themselves that can decide whether a practice is valid or not in the first place, right? New religious movements like Scientology, right? The fact that we have movements like that who want status as religions, as recognized religions, and want to be able to practice accordingly. Whatever our personal feelings about such new religious movements aside, the fact that we have such movements claiming freedom, right? Claiming and demanding freedom to be able to practice how they want, to be able to claim certain rights by virtue of being a recognized religion. These are all the different kinds of identities I saw getting sort of lost, so to say, in the conversation, only being highlighted to be othered, right? Being lost in how the law talks about them, the law, which is meant to be a form of protection for people, getting lost in that, in the crowd, so to say. And like I said, only being talked about when being othered, when being held up as, as a cautionary tale of what not to do so as not to anger the law. And that was interesting, because what started coming out in my inquiry and in my study was that basically anything that fell outside the category of religion was that which was outside the purview of what liberal Protestant idealism had considered religion to be, right? Which included its external practice, its external manifestation. And as a result, the law was failing to protect them. which was interesting. Suddenly I was like, my God, is the law Protestant? Is oh my goodness, like is the law now going to be a liberal Protestant white lady? Is this what's going on? Is this where my inquiry is taking me? And whether it's a white woman or a white man, but it definitely was proving to be a white liberal Protestant, right? That was definitely what the law was. If the law had a face, that's what the face was coming out to be clear to me. And that's where I realized that before I even find out why this is happening, no conversation can happen without the acknowledgement that there needs to be a complete divestment and a complete decolonization of this very concept, right? Because unless and until that's accepted right at the front, identities like mine, identities like Aditi's, identities like so many other people's cannot exist, and any other inquiry might be very good for, intellectual growth and for like feeding my curiosity and helping me get a degree, but it's going to be futile and completely pointless unless that one basic truth is not accepted at the front, that this is a flawed system. This is a system that doesn't serve anyone that doesn't fit this one very specific niche that controls the system, and that it's not going to, if it's not going to benefit, it's definitely not going to protect at all, right? And as a result, as a result, if it's not protecting, what is it doing? It's harming. It's actively harming them. And who is it harming? It's harming the minoritized and racialized people, right? Who are already on the margins of these societies, frankly speaking. Economically on the margins of societies, socially on the margins of these societies, and as I was discovering, legally on the margins of these societies, right? Now, how is this divestment, forget the why, but how is this divestment and decolonization going to even happen? And I think like this avenue is a very interesting sort of example of that, because the first place that we see that can even happen is, and the first place that perhaps it should be happening, is the classroom, right? And that's kind of the premise of what I think I have sort of built up for 6 years in my mind, the answer to all the problems to be, which is, how can we decolonize the law unless and until we go into the classroom, right? And I don't necessarily mean the classroom of the child. I very much mean the classroom of the lawyer, right? I very much mean the 17, 18-year-olds who decide that they're going to university and then pay a lot of money to go to university and then get a law degree. That law degree, that classroom that enables that law degree to be handed out, right? That is where this divestment needs to happen. That's the first place where it needs to happen. And because we can have these conversations, if we are educators, if we are people who like speaking, we can have some really interesting conversations, and we do. I teach in universities, and I have had this conversation that I'm having with you guys numerous times in classrooms, and it's always very interesting. I always have the most engaged students who always have incredible insights to give and are really interested and are really fascinated, and will probably end up writing like earth-shattering exposés in their essays as well about, the way the system is bad and the way it should function. But they won't get their degrees based on those. They will not get a good mark to pass as lawyers for that. So while they can have as many fantastic conversations with me and write excellent essays, they're not going to qualify as lawyers based on that. To qualify as lawyers, they have to learn the settled scholarship on this matter, the settled law of the settler, right? That's who they're going to have to learn, and that's who they're going to have to regurgitate and then put into practice as they go out into the courtrooms, and not just the courtroom then, but then into society, right? And so really, it's the legal classroom that needs to be completely transformed. It's the legal classroom that needs to be completely radicalized and changed for it to be understood in any way whatsoever, right? So getting that out of the way. Once we've got that established, once we've got that settled, everything else can come later. But as long as we've got the premise of that conversation down, that's the basis that we're starting with. Now we can have a further conversation as to, why things are the way they are. And by the way, I didn't say this at the start, but please do feel free to just ask any questions at any point. I know we're meant to, it's like a lecture, but I'm absolutely very happy to just have questions sort of come in as and how. You can write them in the chat or just say them out loud if that's okay with you, Aditi, for them to just shout out their questions. Yeah, just shout out your questions if you have any. And I'm very, very happy for you guys to just scream at me. Something I've learned in Ireland since I moved here is I love the phrase just shout, which I have never heard as a Pakistani before, because shouting is bad where I was raised. But no, it's I love it. And I'm married to a white Irish man now, and so I'm absorbing all the Irishisms in my language. So just shout anything you want to at me, and I will be very happy to answer things to you. But okay, so why is this conversation even particularly important for us where we are? If we're sitting in Europe, as much as one might, and even like, let's for the sake of conversation just admit that like the UK is Europe as well. If we're sitting in Europe, unfortunately, Europe is the epicenter of international law, right? Whether we like it or not. Whether we accept it to be so or not, the fact of the matter is that this is kind of where all the conversation and all the jurisprudence and all the debates sort of stem from. The US is a silo in a sense, whereas Europe tends to have much more trickle-down effects into other societies as well. And so I focus a lot on Europe in my conversation and in my inquiry because, well, one, I'm here, but two, because it is important. It influences the way things around the world function. I mentioned a little while ago about, how Muslim women and their right to veil or wear the hijab or niqab is in conversation. And I mean, we all would know about the way the conversation has grown from out of France, from out of Switzerland. But what was really interesting for me to note was the effect it was having in the third world simultaneously. So as the last year, there was a referendum in Switzerland, so a public vote to decide whether or not Muslim women should be allowed to cover their faces in public spaces, and the referendum was passed by a majority saying that they shouldn't be, right? And very, very soon after, this conversation started in Sri Lanka, miles away from Europe, right? Miles away from Switzerland. Doesn't even share a colonial history with Switzerland. And yet we were having this conversation happening in Sri Lanka. Very, very soon after that, we have seen in the last few months this debate come up in India at the moment, in the state of Karnataka, where this exact same thing is happening again. There is the conversation on whether or not Muslim women should be allowed to participate in public life while covering their faces, or even wearing the hijab, in fact, not just covering their faces, should be allowed. Now we can talk about how that's a result of local politics and how that's a result of the way the geopolitical scenario in those countries is facing. But really, it's hard to miss the interconnectedness of these decisions as they're coming out, right? And so while as upsetting as it might be for me to accept that Europe is the center of the world, unfortunately for our conversation, it is, right? And so I do focus on Europe quite a bit. Because if we look at the context of all the religious and otherwise wars that have shaped Europe, right, and the European project, the European Union into what it is today, it would be incomplete to simply say that religion has played an integral part into what it is today. It would be incomplete to simply say that it is a religion without specifying which religion has been formative in the formation of modern Europe. Europe is suffused with Christianity, or at least memories of its past influence. And this Christian heritage is essential to the civilizational identity of Europe. This is from a New York Times article from not very long ago, right? And that's interesting. That's very evocative language that's being used to describe the centrality of Christianity within Europe. And so therefore, to vaguely credit just all religion for the cultural, political, and legal imprint that Christianity has left on Europe would be an intellectual disservice, because the history of, like we talked about, the history of Europe and Christianity is inextricably entwined. So no one aspect of either can be explained without an explanation of the other as well. But we can't deny that it's a continent that is incredibly religiously diverse as well. And it claims to be committed to the idea of religious and cultural equality. That is the claim. Having a historical hegemony of one predominant religion, which informs much of its present understandings of law, culture, and society, is bound to then create some tension, right? Is equality truly possible when our conception of equality is heavily influenced by a particular theological and philosophical strain of knowledge? Is it even possible for me to be equal to my white European husband? Is it even possible if I claim to be Muslim and he doesn't, right? And this is even before we get into the technicalities of citizenship and the technicalities of borders and nationality, right? If just based on an internal aspect of belief that difference exists, can we even claim to be equal? With Europe having played such a pivotal role in our conceptualization of modernity as we understand it to be today, and in its inextricable facets in the form of democracy and the nation state and human rights and civilization, all these words that are used by white populations all the time to exert control over non-white populations. An examination of the right as it exists in Europe today is critical if we want to understand what religion is and what the right to freedom of religion is, not just in Europe, but outside it as well. And it becomes a necessary tool to predict where this right is going to go on from now. Not just where it has been, but what will happen to my, interracial mixed kids in the future. It becomes incredibly important to understand and answer that question as well. It becomes even more important when we realize that the forum which has generated the most controversy on religion and its place in society, the European Court of Human Rights, is also one of the most heavily criticized ones. It becomes even more complicated when we think of that. Why am I talking about the European Court of Human Rights? Again, because of the very positionality of Europe in the world today, and the very positionality of the kind of cases and decisions that come out of the European Court. All those cases about the veil and the hijab and the niqab and the Sikh turbans, they all went to the European Court. We hear a distilled and watered down version of them in the headlines that don't pay too much emphasis onto the fact that this is the court where those decisions are coming out of, and this is what that means for everyday people. But the fact of the matter is that court plays a central feature in how then these European states implement the laws that impact regular people on an everyday basis. So, am I okay for time still, Aditi?
Yeah, I'd say maybe you've got another, because we started a bit late, you've got another 10 minutes and then we can have questions and a conversation.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Now, the court's conception of religion in legal terms is limited to the idea of belief. What do I mean by that when I say religion and belief? And why am I using two separate terms for that? Belief in this context is very much the internal, that which exists within us, that which we believe, but that we have in our minds and in our hearts or in our souls. Very specifically, Christianity being a form of the belief that the court understands. That also a more liberal Protestant version of Christianity over other overtly communitarian religions, which visibly and obviously manifest themselves. Islam, Sikhism, to quite an extent, even Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity as well. So there's always going to be an inherent bias in favor of liberal Protestant Christianity and how the court understands what religion is and what its manifestation means to different people. It has been occasionally suggested that any examination of religion within the law should not be to discover how the term religion is used, but to know how the term religion should be used. I completely disagree with that because I find that to be a completely futile exercise. To examine how the term religion itself should be used, it is important to know, it's important in order to understand how the term religion should be used, it's important to see how it is currently being used right now as well. There's no point in a false utopia being created unless we examine the very lived reality and the practicalities of present life as it is. And so while I acknowledge and appreciate that at no point does the European Court of Human Rights or any of the people who are judges there or any of the barristers and lawyers who go and practice law there or anybody who actually writes down or makes decisions that has anything to do with the actual legality aspect of it, I recognize and acknowledge that at no point do they explicitly say that they favor a liberal Protestant version of Christianity, right? That's a given. But it does suggest that the way that the way that the court interprets the right to freedom of religion, the way that it interprets what religion is, and tries to reconcile it with the simultaneous and diametrically opposing claims of states and their religiously diverse citizens, betrays that it is informed by Christian understanding of religion, right? Thereby essentially furthering the tension between what the liberal human rights objective of protection of freedom of religion is and the conceptual and very practical implementation or lack thereof of it, right? Just to tell you a little bit more about this internal belief and the manifestation of it. What was really interesting that has come out of all the wars that have happened in Europe over centuries is that religion, despite being an important and very important source of, people's lives, did start being seen as and being perceived as historically a source of great suffering, right? But what was really fascinating to me, an outsider, was how Christianity, despite being seen as a source of great suffering, historically still remained the predominant religion in Europe, right? And was still being accorded a position of privilege, even if observance was seen to be on the decline. Christianity remained ingrained in social and cultural life. And it's interesting that one of the first time historical chroniclers described something as being Christian, something as European, forgive me, was when the Christian Frankish forces had victory over a Muslim army during the Crusades. Is the first time that something was considered European historically, which is wild, right? That that the fact that we were seeing history very much through the lens and we were identifying and defining what it means to be European very much through an active call of violence against an entire population of people, right? And that was seen to be as a truly European act, the first time that something was labeled European. And so the more I looked into this, the more I saw that Western Christianity was historically being seen as synonymous with a European identity, which defined itself against the Occidental, right? The Islamic and Byzantine Orthodox Christian civilizations that were far away, that were separate, that were othered, and that is what defined being European. And as a result, that is what defined being Christian as well, right? Never mind the fact that centuries later, all the brown, black Christians who were going to be converted by missionaries and colonization through the centuries, right? Never mind that. They're an afterthought and then they can be forgotten about. But so what I started seeing was that more and more this tension that Europe had within itself of religion's done so much bad to us, we should definitely keep it out of sight. But religion is important, but it should be out of sight. So it's very important and should be protected when it's inside you. Anything external reminds us of how bad it's been to us, and therefore must be shunned, right? Which is everything that is not liberal Protestantism, basically. So anything that was overtly manifesting its religiosity was seen as suspicious, was seen as other, and was seen as not religious, most importantly, was seen as a cultural thing, or was seen as clearly not as important, because if it was only only that which you need to believe inside is important, anything outside is not. Because it was easy to square away Protestantism with the belief of the internal only, right? Anything else was seen as alien. And this has resulted in, I'm sitting in Ireland, which has seen endless strife between Catholicism and Protestantism, and has seen so much of the struggle and the violence between, like, within Christianity itself, as populations have fought for independence and self-determination. But it really came to a flashpoint when we started seeing immigrants in large numbers in Europe, right? Immigrants in the popular imagination as we see them now, not necessarily immigrants from the 40s, 50s, 60s that we seem to have forgotten about, but very much the present day immigrant, right? Very much the present day overtly religious immigrant that knows the same language of rights that the colonizer uses to further colonize, right? It's an interesting dichotomy to be in, because there are certainly populations that have the language and have the possibility of being able to challenge the same narratives using the same language, which didn't necessarily always exist before. And so what we're seeing now is we're seeing visibility, we're seeing overt manifestations of religiosity being claimed as being important, as being European. And that is challenging this narrative of, no, religion is very important, but only once it's inside your doors, once it's kept at home. We should all not be able to see it. And this challenge is being made using the same, like I said, the same language of rights, using the same tools. Audre Lorde asked, can the master's tools, can the master's tools be used to, dismantle the master's house? The way the language of rights is being used by people around Europe at the moment kind of shows maybe it is. Because we see Muslim populations, we see Black and brown Muslim women who veil, who wear the niqab, using the language of human rights to go to the European Court of Human Rights and challenge this, right? And demand for their rights and say, well, this is an intrinsic part of being European as well. And we will claim and ask for rights in the same locations that you espouse dicta that can go against us, right? It doesn't always work. We have patently seen the European Court give judgments against Black and brown women for claiming for demanding these rights. But the very fact that that language is being used, those same avenues are being utilized to challenge the status quo, so to say. So maybe there is some claim in using the master's tools to hit the master on the head with, maybe, perhaps, but it's something interesting to think about. So I don't want to bore you guys with a massive long history lecture on how, like, everything became Christian in Europe, and how it still is, and how everything is Christian. But the main point of it stands that Europe as an institution doesn't understand religion unless it fits into a very specific niche model that is white and that is liberal and Protestant. And if it doesn't fit into that, it is not seen as being worthy of protection, because it is not seen as religion. It is seen as culture. It is seen as identity and religion are not the same for the European court in this context. And it is seen as therefore unimportant and not worthy of protection. And this is something that is being regurgitated through the generations of lawyers that are coming out, through the generation of legal scholars that are coming out. And so we will see this being perpetuated continuously unless we challenge the way this institution, that is the law, understands what religion is and what it means for people for whom it might not be, for whom religion is multiple different various things, but for whom manifestation of religion is as important as the internal belief of religion. Until and unless the institutionalization of law can understand that and truly acknowledge and accept it, we will not have different decisions coming out. We will not change the narrative. We can keep using the tools to hit the master on his head, but we might not yield any results. And so that changing of the narrative can truly only come from a complete divestment and decolonization of understanding what religion means to the law. And yeah, we might have a better understanding of how people function then in society if that ever happens. Yeah, I'm just going to leave it there for the moment. And thanks very much. I hope that made sense. I hope that was good. I suffer from the chronic problem that all scholars have, which is if you've been sitting in your books for too many months, you kind of forget how to talk to people and explain ideas in a coherent way. But I hope that made sense. And please, any questions, any comments, please feel free to go ahead and ask me now.
Yay. That made so much sense, Sahar. You articulated everything so beautifully and lucidly. So thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor to all you beautiful people. We have a very rare and wonderful opportunity of picking Sahar's brain. Yeah, so feel free to ask a question, anyone.
Hi. There you go. Thank you, Sahar, for your beautiful presentation. You shared so much. Yeah, there's just a lot there to sort of think about. I guess what it made me think about a lot was like, so because for example, like, I don't know, I'm from like France a little bit. And like they do this thing of like, we're secular states. Therefore, everyone has to look the same. But it's doing that exact thing of being very much embedded in sort of Christian, whatever kind of, you know, those are kind of the foundations of what secularism is and what it does. And yeah, it justifies a lot of like for them it justifies a lot of violence when it comes to, like, you know, Islamophobia is a huge problem as a result of that kind of like way of understanding religion and state. And I don't know, it also made me think about because when I was in uni, I did this class called Religion and World Politics, which was, didn't think about it necessarily from a legalistic perspective, but thinking about state and religion being intertwined, right, as institutions. And I got to, we had this one class on this thing called liberation theology, which I'm going to ask you about is like, what do you mean by theology? Because you mentioned it, but what I learned about liberation theology was that it was a way of understanding and reclaiming sort of the Christian faith. And it was one that centered like poor people, you know, it centered the masses, it centered sort of like class differences and like people just being like the marginalized, right? And that kind of expression of, because of like almost resistance against like the sort of the doctrine of the church, which is based in the Vatican, had roots in Latin America, but then a lot of countries in Africa, including Cameroon, which is where I'm from, thought through that sort of theology of like, how do we also understand our cultural and how we produce culture through through belief, but also through faith, because so I don't know, you mentioned like theology, and I guess that really determining our understanding of belief and faith and the systems that we create around those things. Like, what for you is um I guess what does theology mean to you, like a theological sort of take on, maybe, and that related to, I guess, the law, because that's something that you're bringing in, obviously, and thinking through too. I don't know if that's a question that makes sense, but yeah, that's kind of what you made me think about.
Yeah, it does. It absolutely makes sense. Thanks, V, for that. So I think the easiest way to explain theology is literally just religious ideology, right? And the study of religious ideology, or the functioning of religious ideology, right? So when we say a Christian theology, it quite literally just means a Christian religious ethic that informs the way everything around it functions, right? That informs it. So I'm so glad you mentioned liberation theology, because liberation theology, and then the other different theories that have sort of come out of it, are incredibly special and dear to me, right? And so I'm really glad that you brought that up, because exactly like you said, liberation theology sort of like roots and places divinity and the divine through the understanding of the most oppressed in society, and through the upliftment of the most oppressed in society. So so liberation theology, whether it uses those words or not, in lots of cases it does, is an inherently sort of like Marxist approach to understanding religion, right? As polar opposites as they might sound, like Marxism and religion going together, but it really is. It is one of the most class-based understanding of how religion and the divine can work for those who are the most marginalized and oppressed in society, right? And whether they are those who are the most oppressed, or those who are, for example, disabled, and any other kind of, those are the two groups that tend to come up the most in conversations around liberation theology, but any group of marginalized people, right? And that has sort of resulted and given birth to so many different kinds of theories through that. For example, one that is very close and dear to my heart, being Muslim, is Islamic liberation theology, which has come from exactly that, right? But which uses Islam and the relationship with the divine for a Muslim or someone who practices Islam to work in favor of the most oppressed and the most marginalized in society, right? And unsurprisingly, Islamic liberation theology has been used by radical Black thinkers throughout history, right? It has been for a foundational and incredibly important in anti-apartheid struggles by the struggle of Black Muslims in South Africa. It has been foundational and so formative in the way in the way we hear of and see the works and struggles of figures like Malcolm X, for example, right? So it has resulted and sprung in so many different really interesting and really radical and cool theories, which goes to show that it is not impossible to talk about religion and understand religion from a social justice point of view, or from a point of view of upliftment of the most marginalized, right? It is not impossible to understand if I put my lawyer hat away for a second, but it's not impossible to understand and love the divine while also holding true your ideals of social justice, right? It's not impossible to do so. And the example that you gave was exactly right. These theories have come up in response to the violence perpetuated by religious actors, right? So when we talk about Christianity as a whole, it very specifically has worked against the abuses of the Catholic Church, right? When used and utilized by radical Muslims, it very much acts as resistance against oppressive Islamic actors and factions and states that act against its populations and peoples, right? Or even acts as resistance against theology that can oppress, right? That uses the understanding of text to oppress its people. And so you're absolutely right when you talk about how, liberate, like France is a very interesting example of that, because France has such a rich history of its relationship with the Catholic Church, and now espouses secularism to sort of flatten the identities of who can be French, right? Not taking into account its history of colonialism, not taking into account that the French woman who now wails on the streets of Paris is most probably the direct descendant of someone who's come in from a former French colony who was and who was probably enslaved by the French, right, by the white French. So it's that flattening of identities and the lack of nuance that comes out from places like France that is like shocking in that sense, and doesn't acknowledge even the rich history that its predominant religious narrative can actually provide in further giving strength to rights of people as well, right? Like if France was to truly acknowledge perhaps its Christian heritage in a way that works for its populations, it might actually realize so there's a way to square the two without taking away other people's rights, right? But you were right in bringing those examples up, and I'm glad you were thinking along those lines as well, particularly about liberation theology. So thanks. I hope that answered your question.
It did. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer.
Yeah, what a beautifully rich response to V's call. Thank you so much, Sahar. And very quickly, did anyone else want to ask Sahar a question or a reflection, comment?
I guess just really quickly, I wanted to say like thank you so much for your talk. And I wanted to like also just ask like, so I think especially with like what you were saying about like Europe, and like the idea of law as being like very like, I think you said specifically like neoliberal white, basically. And then I was also wondering how like you've seen that impact like, especially with Pakistan, given like Pakistan was colonized by the British, and now like Pakistan is like so homophobic and transphobic, and there's all of this like buildup of like conservatism that like is also a trickle down effect of the British colonization. But then at the same time, they're like, oh, but we're liberal. So I'm wondering if like you have any thoughts of like how that has like really impacted like the culture of Pakistan, and also how like that is like translated for like immigrant families who then go to like European countries or go to America and then like maintain that like kind of like conservatism that wasn't even necessarily a part of the culture before colonialism.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad you asked that, because I'm going to plug my charger in before it dies. I'm so glad you asked that, because there's two facets to that, right? One is the very, very real effects of colonization that we see in the law even today, right? To give you a small example of that, the blasphemy law that exists in Pakistan at the moment is almost worded exactly the way the blasphemy law in Ireland has existed. Ireland just had a referendum a few years ago, I think in 2019, to abolish the blasphemy law from within its constitution. Ireland has a system where they need to have like a public referendum to be able to change their constitution. So it only happened in 2019. It wasn't a law that was used in modern history that we can like in the last few years that one can think about. But the fact of the matter is, it was a remnant of the British, and the fact that it existed in almost identical language is very much a direct result of colonialism, right? So very clearly, the British went in, put in the blasphemy law in place. There's a whole debate as to whether, why, and they put it in place, what was the reason, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, it was done by the British, and that's what resulted in, right? And so yes, if being a lawyer in Pakistan is incredibly frustrating, because you can pick up any piece of legislation and it's either going to be from 100 years ago, written by the British and never changed since then, or be a new piece of legislation that's being passed that is incredibly ill thought out and not really properly, works and serves its populations. So yes, there is very much a very serious impact that colonization has had on the legal structures of countries like Pakistan specifically, right? And that has resulted in the kind of like puritanical laws that have also existed as a result, right? All the laws against indecent acts and public exposure and things like those are very much remnants of the British. But I'm also really wary of putting all the blame on the colonizer in this case. Not to say that the colonizer didn't wreak absolute havoc, right? Like, yes, of course, he did. But there is very much, we took a shitty system and ran with it, effectively, is what has also happened in a place like Pakistan, right? And that very much has to do with what I was talking to V about earlier, abuse of theology as well, right? So around the 70s, it started around the 50s, very, very soon after independence from the British, and then the separation of India and Pakistan. So very, very soon after that, in the 50s it started, but it really ramped up in the 70s when the right wing started pandering to, Saudi money, to oil money, and started putting in place incredibly right-wing extremist Wahhabi ideology for, petrodollars, for, securing its place in the geopolitical narrative around the world, and let loose certain phenomena in the country. And those have taken foothold, right? And the immigrant families that we see that have left Pakistan in the 70s and the 80s, primarily the 80s and the 90s, so those families who now have children who are in their 20s, right? Who are coming of age, so to speak, now. Those families left at the height of when these cultural changes were happening, right? And like you said, carried over the conservatism with them. If it was just a case of the trickle-down effect and the after effects of colonialism, perhaps these families would not find it so hard to square their values with the values of where they're living in now, right? But so that's not just the case. Of course, this is still a fairly simplistic answer as well, because we do still see the colonizer at play here, where it left behind regressive laws and regressive ideals and a culture and fucked off and decided to embrace ideas as modernity and decided to embrace ideas as progress while leaving behind that which was considered backward, right? And decided to progress on its own. So there's a lot more at it in this context, but while I do think that colonial laws are very much a lot to blame into the way criminality is sort of seen in the country and the way it has been developed, it's not the only force at fault, in a sense. And yes, I would love to talk to you about this more as well, inshallah, anytime.
Amazing. Sahar, we could all listen to you for days. You're such a repository of knowledge, and yeah, you render this knowledge very accessible as well. I know that feeling of like just kind of burying yourself in books and then feeling like you're just chatting gibberish to everyone else, but you're not. Your vernacular is clear, and you
Thank you very much.
you have rendered very clear, you know, the kind of intersections, right, between decolonization, the law, religion. And I loved what you were saying about how, you know, how can we make liberation theology and the divine work for the most marginalized in the world. And I think that's something that we can all sit with and think about for the next couple of months, actually, but maybe even our whole lives.
I'll certainly be looking into this forever. I think I'm stuck with it.
Oh, Sahar, Dr. Sahar Ahmed, thank you so much. Big, big love, beautiful one. What an honor.
Thank you so
Have
much.
a beautiful evening.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, beautiful people.